Kidney stones affect as many as 1 in 10 people in their lifetime and can cause excruciating pain. Makes me cross my legs just thinking about them. Oxalate stones are the most common type, forming when the oxalate concentration in your urine gets so high it basically crystallizes out a solution like rock candy. Some foods, like spinach, have lots of oxalates in them. Should we try to reduce our intake of oxalates to lower our risk? It turns out that people who do get stones don't seem to eat any more oxalates on average than people who don't get stones. It may be less what you eat and more what you absorb. People who are predisposed to kidney stones just appear to be born with a higher intestinal oxalate absorption. Their guts just really suck it up. So-called superabsorbers assimilate up to 50% more oxalate than non-stone formers. Overall, the impact of typical dietary oxalate on the amount of oxalates that end up in the urine appears to be small. Even a massive dose of dietary oxalates typically only results in a relatively mild increase in the amount that makes it into your urine. A 25-fold increase in oxalate consumption doesn't even double the concentration of oxalates flowing through your kidneys. So it's really more determined by genetics than diet. But still, until you get your first stone, how do you know if you're a superabsorber or not? Is it safer to just generally avoid higher oxalate fruits and veggies? People who eat more fruits and vegetables may actually tend to get fewer kidney stones. When researchers put it to the test and removed produce from people's diets, their kidney stone risk instead went up. Removing fruits and veggies can make your dietary oxalate intake go down, but your body produces its own oxalate internally as a waste product that you may have a more difficult time getting rid of without the alkalizing effects of fruits and vegetables on your urine pH. This may help explain why those eating plant-based get fewer kidney stones, but it may also be due to their cutting animal protein intake, which can have an acid-forming effect in the kidneys. We've known this for 40 years. Just a single can of daily tuna fish can increase your risk of forming stones 250%. And even just cutting back on animal protein may help cut kidney stone risk in half. Surely there's some level of oxalate intake that could put people at risk regardless. There have been a few rare cases reported of people drinking green juices and smoothies getting oxalate kidney stones, though most had extenuating circumstances. This case describes a woman whose kidneys shut down after a 10-day juice cleanse, which included 2 cups of spinach a day. Normally, we might not expect a cup or 2 of spinach to cause such a violent reaction, but she had 2 aggravating factors. She had gastric bypass surgery, which can increase oxalate absorption, and a history of prolonged antibiotic use. There's actually a friendly bacteria you want in your colon called Oxalobacter that eats oxalate for breakfast, leaving even less for us to absorb. But it can get wiped out by long-term broad-spectrum antibiotic use. She still probably wouldn't have run into a problem, though, if she had used something other than spinach, or beet greens, or Swiss chard, the trifecta of high oxalate greens. Kale has hundreds of times less oxalates than spinach. She would have had to have juiced in excess of 650 cups of kale a day to get a comparable dose. So over those 10 days, more than 6,000 cups of kale. But are the 3 high oxalate greens only a problem for people with extenuating circumstances, or who are otherwise at high risk? And what if you cook the greens? How much is too much? The tragic case in which a green smoothie cleanse shut down the kidneys of a woman who drank 2 cups of spinach a day for just 10 days is complicated by the fact that she had had a gastric bypass and was on prolonged antibiotics, which can both increase absorption of the oxalates in spinach. So can taking megadoses of vitamin C. This guy went into kidney failure juicing spinach and beet greens, but he was also taking about 2,000 milligrams a day of vitamin C. Vitamin C is metabolized into oxalate inside the body, and likely played a role in his oxalate overload. In both cases, their juicing alone was giving them more than 1,200 milligrams of oxalate a day, which is easy with spinach, just 2 cups a day, but practically impossible with most other greens, like kale, requiring more than 600 cups a day. There is one case of apparent dietary oxalate overload-induced kidney failure uncomplicated by surgery, antibiotics, or vitamin C. A man who had lost about 80 pounds eating a diet of greens, berries, and nuts, which evidently included spinach 6 times a day. Tragically, his kidney function never recovered. Remember that study purporting to show a massive load of dietary oxalate didn't have much of an effect on urine levels? That study went up to 250 milligrams of oxalates a day. That is massive if you were talking about most greens. That would be 25 cups of collard greens, 60 cups of mustard greens, 125 cups of kale, or 250 cups of bok choy at a time. But that's less than 1/2 cup of spinach. Spinach really is an outlier. Even though there's small amounts of oxalates found throughout the food supply, spinach alone may account for 40% of oxalate intake in the United States. The Harvard cohorts found that men and older women who ate spinach 8 or more times a month had about a 30% higher risk of developing kidney stones. What if you cook it? Oxalates are water-soluble, so, for example, blanching collard greens can reduce oxalate levels by up to 1/3, so those 25 cups at a time can then be 33. For low oxalate greens, it doesn't matter, cooked or not, since they're so low regardless. Steaming spinach reduces oxalate levels 30%, and boiling cuts oxalate levels more than half. Boil the 3 high oxalate greens, spinach, beet greens, and Swiss chard, and 60% of the oxalates are leached into the cooking water. They start out so high, though, even cooked would contain hundreds of times more than low oxalate greens like kale. For high oxalate greens, it doesn't matter, cooked or not, since they're so high regardless. The bottom line is that anyone with a history of kidney stones, otherwise at high risk, or who eats cups a day, should probably avoid the big 3. This is especially important for those who juice or blend their greens, as oxalates appear to be absorbed more rapidly in liquid than solid form. Another reason to give preference to low oxalate greens is that they are less stingy with their calcium. While less than 1/3 of the calcium in milks may be bioavailable, whether from a cow or a plant, most of the calcium in low oxalate vegetables is absorbed. The calcium bioavailability in some greens is twice that of milk, but the oxalates in spinach, chard, and beet greens bind to the calcium, preventing the absorption. Other high oxalate foods that have been associated with kidney problems at high enough doses include chaga mushroom powder, 4 to 5 teaspoons a day, and you could end up on dialysis. 4 cups a day of rhubarb is also not a good idea. More than a cup a day of almonds or cashews. And then starfruit, which I did a video in the past about. A single dose of about 1.25 cups starfruit juice, or just 4 to 6 fruit. Excessive tea consumption can be a problem, especially instant tea, which boosts urine oxalate nearly 4 times higher than brewed tea. 2 cases of kidney damage have been reported, both of which were attributed to drinking a gallon of iced tea a day. Tea, like spinach, is super healthy, just don't overdo it. How might berries improve human health, healthy aging, and quality of life? Maybe due to their anti-inflammatory effects, since inflammation can be an underlying contributing factor in the development, progression, and complications of a number of chronic diseases. Higher intake of anthocyanins, the brightly colored pigments in berries, has been associated with anti-inflammatory effects, which may be a key component underlying the associated reduction in chronic disease risk. But these are all just associations. You can't prove cause and effect until you put it to the test. A double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trial found that blueberry smoothies could turn off inflammation genes. This is measuring the expression of pro-inflammatory genes in white blood cells taken from individuals before and after 6 weeks of drinking placebo smoothies with no blueberries. They got worse over time. 6 weeks later, more inflammatory chemicals pouring out, whereas the blueberry group started out about the same at week 0. But 6 weeks of daily blueberries, and the expression of inflammatory genes went down. In addition to attenuating inflammation, they demonstrate that blueberry consumption was able to significantly decrease the levels of free radicals in their bloodstream. No change in the placebo group, but after 6 weeks of blueberry smoothies, the amount of free radicals in their blood was extinguished by half. OK, but does all that antioxidant and anti-inflammatory power actually translate into clinical benefits? For example, what is the effect of blueberry consumption on recovery after excessive weightlifting-induced muscle damage? A randomized crossover study, a blueberry smoothie, or an antioxidant-matched placebo smoothie 5 and 10 hours prior to, and then 12 and 36 hours after exercise-induced muscle damage. The smoothies were about a cup and a half of frozen blueberries, a banana, and apple juice. Or without the berries, but dextrose and vitamin C added to match it for calories and antioxidant power. Even so, the blueberries worked better at mopping up free radicals. Here's the oxidative stress without the blueberries. It goes up and stays up. But with the blueberries, it comes right down. Yeah, but what we care about is the recovery of muscle strength, so you can jump right back into training. Same drop in peak torque 12 hours later, but a day later, significantly faster restoration of peak muscle strength, demonstrating that the ingestion of blueberries can accelerate recovery, something that may be especially relevant to athletes who compete over successive days. That's all well and good, but what about using berries to treat inflammatory diseases like arthritis? Yes, they may have protective effects against arthritis in a rat, significantly reducing paw volume, how swollen their paw gets when you inject it with some inflammatory irritant, but there have never been any human arthritis berry studies until now. Remember that amazing study where strawberries alone could reverse the progression of precancerous lesions? The strawberries were dramatically downregulating pro-inflammatory genes. Give strawberries to diabetics for 6 weeks, and not only does their diabetes get better, their C-reactive protein levels, a marker of systemic inflammation, drops 18%. Even just a single meal can help. Have people eat a largely unhealthy breakfast, and the level of inflammatory markers goes up over the next 6 hours, but less so if you added just 5 large strawberries to the meal. So, could strawberries improve pain and inflammation in confirmed knee osteoarthritis? No fear that the title ruined the suspense, but yes, osteoarthritis patients randomized to get like a pint and a half of strawberries a day for 12 weeks, and yeah, certain inflammatory markers plummeted on the strawberries, but did they actually feel any better? Significant reductions in constant pain, intermittent pain, and total pain. The first clinical study on the effects of berries on human arthritis found that a simple dietary intervention, the addition of berries to one's diet, may have a significant impact on pain, inflammation, and overall quality of life in obese adults with osteoarthritis. Over the years, it's been generally accepted that the use of dental floss has a positive effect, removing up to 80% of plaque. How do we know? You can use what's called a split mouth design, where each person can act as their own control. For example, only flossing 1/4 of their mouth. They asked study subjects to stop brushing their lower jaw so that plaque would build up. Then they were randomized to floss half, and leave the other half as the non-flossed control. After 3 weeks, not only did the flossing cut plaque about 60%, more importantly, it cut signs of gingivitis in half, bleeding on probing, and another index of gum inflammation. Note, though, this is comparing flossing to nothing. They weren't allowed to brush the jaw. So yeah, flossing is better than nothing, but is flossing plus brushing better than just brushing alone? The advocacy of floss hinges in large part on common sense, but common sense doesn't go very far as a form of evidence. You don't really know until you put it to the test. What's the efficacy of dental floss in addition to a toothbrush? Surprisingly, only 3 out of the 11 studies they looked at found a significant added benefit. The anti-flossers were positively giddy, comparing dentists who continued to advocate flossing in the face of the data to flat earthers. Dentistry is a profession in denial. Over 80% of people don't floss regularly, and it's just hard for the dental elite to accept that the great unflossed masses were right and us doctors were wrong. Flossing doesn't work, get over it. So, you've heard of the tooth fairy. Is flossing just some tooth fairy tale? This review was published back in 2008. Since then, more studies were published, and while the evidence on additional plaque reduction is weak, at least there's some evidence it helps with gingivitis, which is a primary reason you want to reduce plaque anyway. Why might they have not found stronger evidence? Well, the trials were of poor quality, and so the conclusions must be viewed as unreliable. So basically, we don't have good evidence either way, because good studies really haven't been done. Why not? Why wouldn't Big Floss fund the studies? Because it appears that all floss works the same. If you compare unwaxed to woven to shred-resistant floss, they all have about the same plaque removal efficacy, which it appears all such studies found. So why would a floss company fund a study to show flossing in general is good if they can't show their product is better? Otherwise, you might just go buy their competitor's floss. Where do we stand today? Although technically the evidence for flossing is weak, more importantly, the methodology of the studies examining flossing effectiveness are also weak. For example, they didn't assess the quality of people's flossing. This, for example, is not the way to floss. Don't ask the long story. Bottom line, the American Dental Association continues to recommend brushing and flossing every day, but what's the proper sequence? Should you floss before or after you brush? Some dentists argue that flossing should come first because you stir up the particles and plaque that the toothbrush can then brush away, and then the fluoride from the toothpaste might get in there better. But others recommend brushing first, thinking that that would remove the bulk of the particles first, and then the floss could floss some of the fluoride from the residual toothpaste in there. You don't know until you put it to the test. The effect of toothbrushing and flossing sequence on between-tooth plaque reduction and fluoride retention, a randomized controlled clinical trial, and flossing first won in terms of getting rid of significantly more plaque and getting more of the fluoride in there. When we floss after brushing, much of the particles that are being pushed out by dental floss may stay in place on our teeth. The bottom line is flossing, followed by brushing, is preferred. Excessive spitting up and vomiting in infants may be treated with putting them on their left side down after meals, but of course never when sleeping. It's always face up to wake up to reduce the risk of crib death. Also, you can try smaller, more frequent feedings, thickening or changing formulas, and in breastfed infants, which is ideally how all infants should be, eliminating cow's milk and eggs from the mother's diet. I've talked about how more than 40% of infants with reflux can be successfully treated with cow's milk removal. It can also affect them on the other end, too. It can be a major contributor to diaper rash, and contribute to chronic constipation. In 80% of affected kids, though only a single kid tested positive for an actual cow's milk allergy. So it was like some kind of sensitivity reaction that can really only be diagnosed by giving a cow's milk-free diet a try. Anal fissures in infants may be practically pathognomonic for cow's milk allergy, meaning so characteristic of the condition that it could be used as a diagnostic sign, no allergy testing required. It's like when cow milk hypersensitivity was demonstrated in 10 of 17 children with severe reflux. In the majority of patients, the hypersensitivity to cow milk was identified only by eliminating it and then re-challenging to confirm. They did endoscopies, measured the acid gurgling up before and after milk, and then verified by repeating milk exposure with double-blind, placebo-controlled challenges when necessary. Yet all but one of the children proven to have this adverse reaction to dairy tested negative on allergy tests. So tested negative for cow's milk allergy, but still got better by cutting the cow's milk out, showing that this association between cow milk hypersensitivity and severe GERD, the severe reflux, was observed not only in infants, but also in older children. Another disease that can be cured with cow's milk elimination is eosinophilic esophagitis, a chronic inflammatory disorder of the esophagus, the tube that connects your mouth to your stomach. To figure out what's causing the inflammation, an elimination diet is prescribed, where you basically remove everything, and then every time you add back a food, they stick an endoscope down your throat and take biopsies to see if that one food made things worse. And how many freaking foods are there out there? I mean, you can imagine how difficult and costly and invasive this is for families, how confusing and frustrating. So these researchers at Northwestern figured, let's just see what happens if you just remove one food from their diet instead of making them go through all that. And just eliminating cow's milk induced remission in 65% of the children they tried it on. I mean, normally you'd have to put these kids on steroids, where they try to coat their throat with steroids to knock down their immune response, and then that sets you up for infections like thrush. And of course, as soon as you stop the steroids, the esophageal inflammation comes raging back because you're not treating the underlying cause. But steroids are considered the standard of care. Too bad there's never been like a head-to-head test of cow's milk elimination versus steroids, until now. A comparative effectiveness trial of cow's milk elimination versus a swallowed steroid, and they both appeared to work just as well, which is to say the cow's milk elimination worked better because no side effects, and you're treating the actual cause, suggesting getting rid of dairy products should be considered the first-line therapy. In adolescence, cow's milk protein intolerance can contribute to chronic fatigue syndrome, evidently a common problem in young people with chronic fatigue, and most importantly, a treatable contributor to their symptoms. But again, most were unaware that dairy was a problem, possibly because it can take hours between milk ingestion and when you start feeling worse, so people don't make the connection. So even those who report no problems after milk ingestion may still be suffering problems after milk ingestion. And finally, what about adults? Well, there's lactose intolerance. Most people on Earth are lactose intolerant after weaning, with the exception of some human populations that developed lactose tolerance about 10,000 years ago, thanks to a mutation in the lactase gene, which enabled adult humans to digest lactose, milk sugar, or at least those select European populations, whereas most Hispanics, most Africans, and Asians remain intolerant, which may be a good thing, since acid regurgitation, reflux heartburn, is so common among adults in the Western world. And food intolerance may play a role in adults as well. Milk was found to be the leading culprit, but they were using what's called a leukocytotoxic test, where you see how someone's white blood cells react to individual foods in a petri dish. This test is frowned upon by professional allergy associations as not being sufficiently sensitive and specific. Can't hurt, though, to put it to the test. A double-blind, randomized controlled trial performed in 38 reflux patients for which proton pump inhibitor drugs failed to completely control their symptoms. OK, well, let's give diet a try. They randomized people to a diet in which they excluded foods they tested sensitive to, most often dairy, versus a diet which instead excluded foods for which they didn't test positive for to control for the placebo effect. A month later, the symptoms in the control group dropped, but the symptoms in the true diet exclusion group dropped significantly further. They kind of felt bad for the control group, so they switched them to the right diet too, and 2 months later everyone was feeling better. Approximately 1 in 6 couples are unable to conceive after a year despite trying and are labeled infertile. And in up to half the cases, it may be the man's fault. There are several lifestyle factors that have been associated with diminished sperm production, such as smoking cigarettes. What about smoking marijuana? Regular marijuana smoking more than once a week was associated with about a 28% lower sperm concentration and lower total sperm count, based on a study of more than 1,000 men. But no adverse association was found for irregular use, meaning less than once a week. Now, this wasn't a randomized study, and so there may have been other factors that go along with regular marijuana use that could have really been to blame, but they took into account cigarettes, and alcohol and other drugs and STDs and things like that, but there's always a possibility there's something else for which they didn't control. Findings were similar for women. Hundreds of infertile couples were studied in California, and just like men had about a quarter fewer sperm, a quarter fewer eggs were retrieved from women using cannabis more than 90 times in their lifetime, or using the year before. Again, there could have been confounding factors, but until we know more, couples that are trying to conceive may want to make the joint decision to turn over a new leaf. What about during pregnancy? Medical authorities recommend that women even contemplating pregnancy should be encouraged to discontinue marijuana use and not use during pregnancy or lactation, although the Academy of Breastfeeding Medicine suggests the known benefits of breast milk currently outweigh any potential harms for women who continue to smoke it. Despite these warnings from authorities, marijuana use has increased among pregnant women in recent years, up 60%, but that's only from about 2.5% up to less than 4%, less than half the frequency of non-pregnant women. Why are OBGYNs so down on getting high? You'll see scary articles in the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology making claims like this: a large study supposedly documenting a significantly increased risk for a serious birth defect. But if you don't just take their word for it and pull up the actual study, you'll see that the association wasn't statistically significant after all. Objective education about marijuana and pregnancy is good, but biased education is not. There have been some risks identified. Infants may be more likely to be born anemic, or have a lower birth weight, or require intensive care compared to infants of mothers who do not use marijuana. But it's difficult to determine the direct effects of maternal cannabis use on the developing fetus because of a variety of confounding factors for which studies may not have been able to completely control. Studies also show links between prenatal marijuana exposure and learning problems later in life, manifesting years later at school. And that's really where the greater concern lies, the potential long-term effects on brain development. And so even after weeding out the myths, there is enough concern that pregnant and breastfeeding women should indeed probably be advised to either decrease or, where possible, cease cannabis use entirely. There have been calls to ban the advertising of sugary cereals to children for nearly a half-century, a product that Harvard nutrition professor Gene Mayer referred to as sugar-coated nothings. In a Senate hearing on nutrition education, he said, properly speaking, they ought to be called cereal-flavored candy rather than sugar-coated cereals. The Senate committee invited the major manufacturers of children's cereals to testify, and they initially said yes, until they heard what kind of questions they were going to be asked. One cereal industry representative candidly admitted why they decided to boycott the hearing. They simply didn't have persuasive answers for why they're trying to sell kids breakfast candy. In the Mad Men age, before the consumer movement was in bloom, ad company executives were more willing to talk frankly about the purpose of their ads and how they felt about aiming the ads at the quote-unquote child market. A quote from the executive director of Kellogg's ad firm: "Our primary goal is to sell products to children, not educate them. When you sell a woman a product, and she goes into the store and finds your brand isn't in stock, she'll probably forget about it. But when you sell a kid on your product, if he can't get it, he will throw himself on the floor, stamp his feet, and cry. You can't get a reaction like that out of an adult." Sugary cereals are the #1 food advertised to kids. But not to worry, the industry will just self-regulate. The Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative was launched, in which all the big cereal companies pledged they would only market healthier dietary choices to kids. The candy industry signed on too. How did that go? They pledged not to advertise to kids, yet after the initiative went into effect, kids actually saw more candy ads. Take Hershey, for example, doubled their advertising to children, while at the same time pledging not to. The cereal companies got to decide for themselves their own definitions of quote-unquote healthier dietary choices. So that should give us some sense of how serious they are at protecting children. They chose Froot Loops and Reese's Peanut Butter Puffs, consisting of up to 44% sugar by weight. Those are what they classified as healthier dietary choices. What are their unhealthy choices? Turns out what they did is basically just set the limit based more on what they were already selling than what might be best for children. Now they've since revised that down to only allow cereals that are 38% sugar by weight. But look, even if they're only a third sugar, that means kids are effectively eating a spoonful of sugar for every 3 spoons of cereal. Not exactly a healthier dietary choice. The Federal Trade Commission tried stepping in back in 1978, but industry poured in so many millions of lobbying might that Congress basically threatened to yank the entire agency's funding should they mess with big cereal, demonstrating just how powerful market forces are compared to those that can be mobilized on behalf of children. The political post-traumatic stress induced by the aggressive attacks on the FTC led to a 25-year hiatus in federal efforts to rein in food marketing aimed at children. But finally, enter the Interagency Working Group, voluntary principles designed to encourage stronger and more meaningful self-regulation, proposed by the Federal Trade Commission, CDC, FDA, and USDA, with the radical suggestion of not marketing children's cereals that are over 26% pure sugar. Not a single one of the top 10 breakfast cereals marketed to children would meet that standard. General Mills shot back that such proposed nutrition standards were arbitrary, capricious, and fundamentally flawed. No surprise, since literally every single cereal they market wouldn't make the cut. To suggest voluntary standards would unconstitutionally violate their right to free speech under the First Amendment, to which the FTC basically said, let me get you a dictionary. Voluntary. How could suggesting voluntary guidelines violate the Constitution? That's how freaked out the industry is, though, at even the notion of meaningful guidelines. One Grocers Association called the proposed nutrition principles the most bizarre and unconscionable they had ever seen. So, what happened? Again, agency funding was jeopardized, and so the FTC called the interagency proposal off. At every level of government, the food and beverage industries have won fight after fight, nearly never losing a significant political battle in the United States. We just got beat, one of the child advocacy organizations said. Money wins. And it took lots of money, $175 million of big food lobbying, but apparently enough to buy the White House's silence as the interagency proposal got killed off. As one Obama advisor put it, you can tell someone to eat less fat, consume more fiber, more fruits and vegetables, and less sugar, but if you start naming foods, you cross the line. I'm upset with the White House, the chair of the Senate Health Committee said. They went wobbly in the knees, and when it comes to children's health, they shouldn't go wobbly in the knees. We have 100 trillion microorganisms residing in our gut, give or take a few trillion, but the spread of the Western lifestyle has been accompanied by microbial changes, which may be contributing to our epidemics of chronic disease. The problem is that we're eating these meat-sweet diets characterized by a high intake of animal products and sugars, processed foods, and a low intake of whole plant foods. Contrary to the fermentation of the carbohydrates that make it down to our colon, the fiber and resistant starch that benefit us through the generation of those magical short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, microbial protein fermentation. When excess protein is consumed, that generates potentially toxic and pro-carcinogenic metabolites involved in colorectal cancer. And so what we eat can cause an imbalance in our gut microbiome and potentially create a recipe for colorectal cancer, where a high-fat, high-meat, high-processed food diet tips the scale towards dysbiosis and colorectal cancer, whereas a high-fiber and starch, lower-meat diet can pull you back into symbiosis with your friendly flora and away from cancer. We now have evidence from interventional studies suggesting that adopting a plant-based, minimally processed high-fiber diet may rapidly reverse the effects of meat-based diets on the gut microbiome. So what might be a new form of personalized microbiome medicine for chronic disease? It's called food, which can rapidly and reproducibly alter the human gut microbiome. Switch people between a whole food plant-based diet and more of an animal food-based diet, and you can see dramatic shifts within 2 days, which can result in toxic metabolites. Switch people to an animal food-based diet, and levels of deoxycholic acid go up, which is a secondary bile acid known to promote DNA damage and liver cancers. Why do levels go up? Because the bad bacteria producing this stuff triple in just 2 days. And over time, the richness of the microbial diversity in our gut is disappearing. Here's our bacterial tree of life that's getting depleted. Why is this happening? The fiber gap. A low-fiber diet is a key driver of microbiome depletion. Yeah, there's antibiotics and cesarean sections and indoor plumbing, but the only factor that has been empirically demonstrated to be important is a diet low in MACs, not Big Macs, microbiota-accessible carbohydrates, which is just a fancy name for fiber, found in whole plant foods, and resistant starch, found mostly in beans, peas, lentils, and whole grains. Our intake of dietary fiber, our intake of whole plant foods, is negligibly low in the Western world when compared to what we evolved to eat over millions of years. Such a low-fiber diet provides insufficient nutrients for our gut microbes, leading not only to the loss of bacterial diversity and richness, but also to the reduction in the production of those beneficial fermentation end products that they make with the fiber. We are, in effect, starving our microbial self. What are we going to do about the deleterious consequences of a diet deficient in whole plant foods? Create newfangled functional foods, of course, and supplements and drugs, prebiotics, probiotics, symbiotics. Think how much money there is to be made. Or we could just eat the way our bodies were meant to eat. What kind of value is that going to get for your stockholders, though? Don't you know probiotic pills may be the next big source of big pharma billions? Why eat healthy, though, when you can just have someone else eat healthy for you and then get a fecal transplant from a vegan? Researchers compared the microbiomes of vegans versus omnivores and found that vegans' friendly flora were churning out more of the good stuff, showing that a plant-based diet may result in more beneficial metabolites in the bloodstream and less of the bad stuff like TMAO. But while the impact of a vegan diet and what the bacteria were making was large, the effect of the composition of the gut microbiome was surprisingly modest. They only found slight differences between the gut microbiomes of omnivores versus vegans. That was a shocker to the researchers. I mean, this very modest difference juxtaposed against the significantly enhanced dietary consumption of fermentable plant foods. The vegans were eating nearly twice the fiber. Anyone see the problem here? The vegans just barely made the minimum daily intake of fiber. Why? Because Oreos are vegan, Cocoa Pebbles are vegans, French fries, Coke, potato chips. There are vegan Doritos and Pop-Tarts. You can eat a terrible vegan diet. Burkitt showed that you need to get at least 50 grams a day of fiber for colon cancer prevention. That's only half of what our bodies were designed to get. We evolved getting about 100 grams a day. And that's what you see in modern populations that are immune to epidemic colorectal cancer. So what if instead of feeding people a vegan diet, you just fed people that kind of diet, a diet centered around whole plant foods. Colon cancer is our second leading cancer killer, but some places, like rural Africa, have more than 10 times lower rates than we do. The reason we know it's not genetic is that migrant studies, such as those in Japanese Hawaiians, have demonstrated that it only takes one generation for the immigrant population to assume the colon cancer incidence of the host Western population. Now, the change in diet is considered most probably responsible for this, but there's all sorts of changes when you move from one culture to another, like smoking rates, different exposures to chemicals, infections, antibiotics. You don't know if it's the diet until you put it to the test. It's rare I do a whole video on a single study, but I think you'll agree this one is worth it. This international group of researchers were trying to figure out why colon cancer rates were an order of magnitude higher here in African Americans and Caucasians than in rural Africa. Well, if you look at American colons, they're a mess. Polyps, diverticulosis, not to mention hemorrhoids, whereas the African colons were remarkably pristine, and more importantly, 7-fold lower colonic epithelial proliferation rates, a characteristic of precancerous conditions. They measured everything that they were eating and concluded that the higher colorectal cancer risk and proliferation rates were most closely associated with higher dietary intakes of animal products, which may have led to higher colonic populations of these potentially toxic acid and bile salt-producing bacteria, but you don't know until you put it to the test. Higher rates are associated with higher animal protein and animal fat, and lower fiber consumption, more of those bad bile acids, less of those good short-chain fatty acids like butyrate, and that higher mucosal proliferation. But how do we know it's the diet that's mucking things up? You don't know until you perform an interventional study. How about we just swap their diets? Feed the Americans a high-fiber African-style diet, and those poor Africans get the sad, standard American diet, like sausage and white flour pancakes for breakfast, a burger and fries for lunch, and like some meatloaf and white rice for supper. That was day one for the rural Africans in the experiment, whereas the Americans were forced to eat fruits and vegetables, corn and beans. To help with compliance, they threw in more familiar foods like veggie dogs, though note it was not a vegan diet, just generally plant-based. And the food exchanges weren't for like years, but just 2 weeks. Could they see changes that fast? The dietary changes resulted in remarkable reciprocal changes in the lining of their colons in terms of cancer risk and their microbiome. Switching to plant-based boosted the fiber fermentation and suppressed the carcinogenic bile acid synthesis. Let's look at some before and after pictures. They took biopsies, and this is the colon lining of an African American under a microscope. Those brown dots mark dividing cells. Their colon lining was in overdrive, the cells rapidly dividing, a sign of pre-malignancy, a risk factor for cancer. But just 2 weeks eating a healthier diet, and their colons calmed right down. The Africans started out with some proliferation, but it got worse on the American diet. This is a different marker measuring inflammation. Each of the brown dots here represents an inflammatory cell, so rife inflammation before, calmed way down after just 2 weeks, and the opposite in those eating worse. We know that when our friendly flora ferment fiber, they produce beneficial compounds like butyrate, which is anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer. Well, impressively, Africanization of the diet more than doubled butyrate production, whereas Westernization cut it in half. In terms of toxic metabolites, a significant drop on the healthier diet, whereas the meatloafy diet increased the levels of these carcinogens by 400% within just 2 weeks. So, bottom line, no pun intended, what they were able to show is that just by changing the food, you can remarkably change your risk. In fact, that's how the lead investigator put it. Change your diet, change your cancer risk. It may be never too late to start eating healthier. Based on these kind of data, Adopting a whole food vegan or even just near vegan diet, rich in fruits and vegetables, along with other healthy lifestyle decisions, could have a stunningly positive impact on the cancer risk not only of Black Americans, but of all peoples. While it might be unrealistic to expect rapid and profound lifestyle changes in the general population, hey, at least we have sound, effective advice to offer to those who make the choice to take the steps needed to optimize their healthful longevity. Canada now allows a health claim on the labels of products with flax seeds, saying that we know with sufficient certainty that flax seeds do indeed help lower cholesterol levels. The products have to contain 2 tablespoons and have to be relatively healthy in the first place, so they can't boast about the cholesterol-lowering effects of a flaxseed-enriched meatball or something. Such claims are based on studies like this, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled trials. Wait, how do you come up with placebo food? I mean, there's sugar pills for drugs, but how can you slip spoonfuls of flax past someone? The researchers made all these special products, snack bars, and muffins, and bagels, so the research subjects unknowingly would be getting tablespoons of ground flax seeds, or just tablespoons of the control, whole wheat. And they did this for a year. No one knew who got which muffins until the code was broken at the end. And the dietary flaxseed group saw a 15% reduction in LDL cholesterol as early as 1 month into the trial, but only fell significantly lower than the whole wheat group and those on cholesterol-lowering drugs. And those off drugs, the whole wheat group's cholesterol went down too, diminishing the efficacy of the flax in comparison. That's why food placebos are so hard. Like in this study, the reason they give for doing a so-called open-label study, where the study group is aware that they're eating flax seeds, is because they couldn't come up with an inert placebo for flax seeds. I mean, whole wheat flour is a whole grain and could be beneficial in its own right, and white flour could make the control group look even worse. So what they did in this study was that overweight patients were randomly assigned to receive either lifestyle advice and daily ground flax seeds, or just the lifestyle advice alone as the control group. And not surprisingly, body weight, waist circumference, and body mass index decreased significantly in both groups. Even without the lifestyle advice, just enrolling people in a study where you know they're going to keep weighing you can get people to lose weight, though there was a significantly greater reduction in the flaxseed group, and not just by a little. The control group that just got lifestyle advice over a 12-week period lost nearly 7 pounds and an inch off their waist. But the group that got the same advice plus spoonfuls of flax a day, so in effect given more food to eat, lost over 20 pounds on average over the same period, cut nearly 4 inches off their waist. Those are extraordinary numbers for an intervention that added rather than actively removed calories from the diet. Was that just some crazy fluke? How about flaxseed supplementation for non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? Thanks to the obesity epidemic, that's now the most common liver disease, recognized as a major public health problem around the world. A high-fat diet is the most common cause, but flaxseed fat may be better compared to lard. Well, that's not very helpful, so let's put it to the test. Same as last time, lifestyle modification advice with or without flax seeds. They were told to just mix it with water and juice and drink it down after breakfast, and body weight went down, along with liver inflammation and scarring and fat inside the liver in both groups, but better in the flaxseed group. And again, that extraordinary 20-pound weight loss telling people to add something to their diet. So maybe that first study wasn't a fluke. Or maybe they both were. There have been dozens of randomized controlled trials of flax seeds and weight loss, and as you can see, most were more equivocal. Here's those 2 recent 20-pound weight loss studies, which appear to be the outliers. But still, put all the studies together, and you do see a significant reduction in body weight, BMI, and waistlines following flaxseed supplementation in randomized controlled trials, though one would expect more like 2 pounds of weight loss rather than 20. Dental cavities may be humanity's most prevalent disease, affecting 35% of the global population. The average number of decayed, missing, and filled teeth has been estimated at more than 2 by age 12. In the United States, the oral health of our elderly may also be in a state of decay, with 1/4 of elderly persons missing all their teeth, and an estimated $100 billion of all that is due to sugar. Sugar consumption is considered the one and only cause of cavities. Though often referred to as a multifactorial condition, the other factors— the bacteria, the plaque, the saliva, the brushing, the flossing— appear to just have mitigating influences. All the other factors simply modify the speed by which sugar causes cavities. Without sugars, the chain of causation is broken, and the disease does not occur. We might not even need all that stuff if we could just get rid of added sugar. Studies dating back decades ago show that in countries where sugar consumption was very low, dental cavities was almost non-existent, and new analyses show that the lifelong burden of cavities increases as sugar intake increases from zero. The most comprehensive national data are from Japan, before, during, and after World War II, where the incidence of cavities tracked per capita sugar intake as it dropped from about 8% of calories down to just 0.1%, less than a teaspoon a week, before rebounding to about 14%. Such studies show that cavities continued to occur even when sugar intake comprised only 2 to 3% of caloric intake. Given that more extensive disease in adults doesn't appear to manifest if sugar intakes are limited to less than 3% of caloric intake, a public health goal to limit sugar intake to below 3% has been recommended. This led to the suggestion that traffic light labels mark anything above 2.5% added sugars as high. That would make even comparatively low-sugar breakfast cereals such as Cheerios red light foods. The recommended 3% cap on total daily intake of added sugars wouldn't even allow for a single average serving for young children of any of the top 10 breakfast cereals most heavily advertised to them. Obviously, soda is off the table. One can has nearly 2 days' worth. The American Academy of Pediatric Dentistry adopted the more pragmatic goal, recommending sugar intake stay below 5% for children and adolescents, matching to the World Health Organization's conditional recommendations for both children and adults. That's about where sugar dropped to in Iraq when they were under sanctions, and it cut cavity rates in half within just a few years. Of course, the sanctions may have cut other things, like children's lives, short, though that was apparently fake news, a consequence of government manipulation. Anyway, if we were really interested in minimizing disease, the ideal goal would be to drop the intake of free sugars to zero, meaning added sugars. They're not talking about sugars naturally found in breast milk or the intrinsic sugars found in fruit. But when it comes to added sugars, there does not seem to be a threshold for sugar intake below which there are no adverse effects. An exponential increase in cavity rates for sugar intakes even starting as low as 1%. Yeah, maybe we could get rid of cavities if there was no sugar in the diet, wrote a Kellogg's-funded researcher. This ideal is impractical. The dictatorial use of foods friendly to the teeth might promote dietary celibacy, not acceptable to all individuals. Instead of recommending draconian reductions in sugar intake, the sugar industry responded, attention would be better focused on fluoride toothpaste. That's the perfect metaphor for medicine's approach to lifestyle diseases in general. Why treat the cause when you can just treat the consequences, right? Like, why eat healthier to prevent and treat heart disease when we have all these statins and stents? Dr. Kim Williams, immediate past president of the American College of Cardiology, started out an editorial on plant-based diets with the classic Schopenhauer quote that all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Second, it is violently opposed. Third, it is accepted as like, duh, of course. In 2013, plant-based diets for diabetes were in the ridiculed stage in the official endocrinology practice guidelines, placed in the fad diets section. They acknowledged strictly plant-based diets have been shown to reduce the risk for type 2 diabetes and improve management of diabetes better than the American Diabetes Association recommendations, but then inexplicably go on to say that the evidence doesn't support the use of one type of diet over another with respect to diabetes or in general. The best approach for a healthy lifestyle is simply the amelioration of unhealthy choices, whatever the heck that means. But by 2015, the clinical practice guidelines from the same professional associations explicitly endorsed as their general recommendation for diabetic patients a plant-based diet. Times they are a-changin'. The American Diabetes Association itself is also now on board, listing it as one of the dietary patterns acceptable for the management of the condition. But the Canadian Diabetes Association has really taken the lead. Type 2 diabetes is considered one of the fastest-growing diseases in Canada, representing a serious public health concern, so they're not messing around, recommending plant-based diets for disease management because of their potential to improve body weight and blood sugar control, as well as heart disease risk, in addition to reducing the need for diabetes medications. They use the Kaiser Permanente definition, a regimen that encourages whole, plant-based foods and discourages meats, dairy, and eggs, as well as all refined and processed junk. They recommend diabetes education centers in Canada improve patients' perceptions of plant-based diets by developing educational materials and providing individualized counseling sessions to address what barriers people have to eating plant-based. The biggest barrier identified was ignorance. Nearly 9 out of 10 patients interviewed had never even heard of using a plant-based diet to treat diabetes. Why is that? Maybe patient awareness of the benefits are being influenced by the perception of the diabetes educators and clinicians. See, most of the staff were aware, yet only about 1 in 3 were currently recommending it. Why not? One of the common reasons given was that they didn't think their patients would do it, so they didn't even bring it up. But this notion is contrary to the patient survey results they cite, in which most patients said they would be willing to at least give it a try. The researchers cite the PCRM Geico studies I did videos about, in which strictly plant-based diets were well accepted, with an over 95% adherence rate, presumably because they just felt so much better, increased energy, better digestion, better sleep and satisfaction. A number of staff members also expressed their second reason for not recommending this diet, not being clear about the supportive scientific evidence, but has been shown to be more effective than an American Diabetes Association recommended diet at reducing the use of diabetes medication, long-term blood sugar control, and cholesterol. It's therefore possible that the diabetes educators were simply behind the times, as there's a lag time in dissemination of new scientific findings from the literature to the clinician and finally to the patient. That's one of the reasons I started nutritionfacts.org, to speed up the process. As Dr. Williams put it, the evidence for the benefits of plant-based nutrition continues to mount. This now includes lower rates of stroke, hypertension, diabetes, obesity, heart attacks, and cardiac death, as well as many non-cardiac issues that affect our patients in cardiology, ranging from cancer to a variety of inflammatory conditions. The science we got. The bigger challenge is overcoming the inertia, culture, and habit, and widespread marketing of unhealthy foods. He concludes, reading the existing scientific literature and evaluating the impact of plant-based nutrition clearly represents the single most important yet underutilized opportunity to reverse the pending obesity and diabetes-induced epidemic of disease and death. Horace Fletcher proclaimed one of his obituaries in 1919, taught the world to chew. Also known as the Great Masticator, Fletcher was a health reformer who popularized the idea of chewing each mouthful more than 32 times, 1 for every tooth. It wasn't put to the test, though, until nearly a century later. People were told to eat pasta until they were comfortably full, but were randomized to either chew each mouthful 10 times or chew each mouthful 35 times before swallowing. The subjects were told it was a study about the effects of chewing on mood, but that was just a ruse. What the researchers really wanted to know is whether prolonged chewing reduced food intake. And those who chewed more felt full earlier than those who chewed less, such that they ended up eating about 1/3 of a cup less pasta overall. If chewing in some way suppresses your appetite, what about chewing gum as a weight loss strategy? An article entitled "Benefits of Chewing Gum" suggested as much, but it was written by the executive director of the Wrigley Science Institute. Let's see what the science says. Big Gum likes to point to this letter published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 1999. Mayo Clinic researchers claimed gum chewing could burn 11 calories an hour. Critics pointed to the fact that they didn't really test typical gum chewing, instead chewing the equivalent of 4 sticks of gum at a quote-unquote very rapid cadence. Specifically, they were instructed to chew at a frequency of precisely 100 Hz for 12 minutes. That seemed to burn 2.2 calories, hence potentially 11 calories an hour. One might have had more confidence in the Mayo scientists' conclusion had they not lacked a fundamental understanding of basic units. 100 Hz would mean 100 chews per second, which would be a very rapid cadence indeed. If the 11 calories an hour is true, though, that would mean you could burn more calories actively chewing gum sitting in a chair than you would not chewing gum upright at a standing desk. But chewing one small piece of gum at your own pace may only burn about 3 calories an hour, which would approximate the calorie content of sugar-free gum itself. But look, chewing off the calories of a piece of sugar-sweetened gum might take all day. OK, but what about the purported appetite-suppressing effect of all that chewing? The results from studies on the effects of gum chewing on hunger are all over the place. Some studies show decreased appetite, some showed no effect, and one even showed significantly increased hunger after gum chewing among women. The more important question, though, is, are there any changes in subsequent calorie intake? Again, the findings are mixed. One study even found that while gum chewing didn't much impact M&M consumption, it did appear to decrease the consumption of healthy snacks. But they used mint gum, and the healthy snacks included mandarin orange slices, so this may have just been a orange juice after toothbrushing effect. It can take an hour before the residual taste effect of mint toothpaste dissipates. This is bad if it cuts your fruit intake, but what about harnessing this power against Pringles? An international group of researchers had people eat Pringles potato chips for 12 minutes, interrupting them every 3 minutes to swish with a menthol mouthwash. Compared to those in the control group, swishing with water or nothing at all, the minty mouthwash group cut their consumption 29%. The researchers conclude, if a consumer finds themselves snacking on too many chips, one potential strategy could be intervening by having a peppermint tea, menthol-flavored chewing gum, or brushing their teeth to slow down or stop snacking. What really matters, though, is weight loss. Even if some tweak like gum chewing can affect the consumption of a single snack, your body could just compensate by eating more later in the day. The only way to know for sure if gum chewing can be used as a weight loss hack is to put it to the test. Chewing gum may only burn about 3 calories an hour. But the calorie expenditure is not just your little jaw muscles at work. For some reason, gum chewing revs up your heart rate, as much as an extra 12 beats per minute after chewing 2 sticks of gum. Here's your heart rate and blood pressure 5 minutes before you start chewing. Then chewing for 5 minutes, then you stop. That was them just sitting quietly. It also works while walking, increasing your heart rate by about 3 beats more per minute, and proving scientifically that people can indeed walk and chew gum at the same time. But does this translate into weight loss? Researchers at the University of Buffalo asked study participants to go for weeks chewing gum before every single eating occasion, or chew no gum at all. On the gum chewing weeks, they didn't just have to chew gum before each meal, but before each snack or even each drink that had any calories in it. This may have been too much for folks, so they actually ended up eating on fewer occasions, switching from 4 meals a day on average down closer to 3. But they ended up eating more calories at each of those fewer meals, and so had no overall significant change in calorie intake, and so, no surprise, had no change in weight. University of Alabama researchers tried a different tact, randomizing people to chew gum after and between meals. After 2 months, compared to those randomized to avoid gum entirely, no improvements were noted in weight, BMI, or waist circumference. But what about those few studies that suggested gum chewing had an appetite-suppressing effect? In this study, people ate 68 fewer calories of pasta at lunch after 20 minutes of gum chewing. Yeah, but other studies showed differently. Whenever there are conflicting findings, instead of just throwing your hands up, it can be useful to try to tease out any study differences that could have potentially accounted for the disparate results. The obvious consideration is funding source. This was a publicly funded study. But that failed Alabama weight loss study was funded by a gum company, so the outcomes are not necessarily predetermined. Different types of gum using different sweeteners may have contributed to the diversity of findings. That one study showing gum chewing instead actually may increase appetite, for example, was done with aspartame-sweetened gum. People reported feeling hungrier after chewing the sweetened gum, not only compared to no gum, but compared to chewing the same gum with no added aspartame. True, not a single randomized controlled trial has ever shown a benefit to gum chewing, but they've all used gum containing artificial sweeteners. There was a landmark study that showed that sip size matters. Have people drink at the same rate, but give them a sip every 2 seconds or a quadruple-sized gulp every 8 seconds, and the smaller sip group won out, satiating after about 1.5 cups compared to 2 cups when taking larger swigs. This is thought to be because of increased orosensory exposure. Your brain is picking up the more frequent pulses of flavor and calories, but repeat the experiment with an artificially sweetened diet drink, and the effect appears to be blunted. So maybe a different type of gum would have a different effect? The positive pasta study was performed using gum mainly sweetened with sorbitol, a sweet compound found naturally in foods like prunes, but like prunes can have a laxative effect. Case reports like this: an air stewardess with puzzling diarrhea unveil what can happen when you eat 60 sticks of sorbitol-sweetened sugar-free gum a day. Another was entitled Severe Weight Loss Caused by Chewing Gum, but not in a good way. A 21-year-old woman ended up malnourished after suffering up to a dozen bouts of diarrhea a day for 8 months due to the 30 grams of sorbitol she was getting chewing sugar-free gum and candies every day. Most people suffer gas and bloating at 10 grams of sorbitol a day, which is about 8 sticks of sorbitol-sweetened gum, and at 20 grams, most get cramps and diarrhea, so you want to be careful how much you eat. The bottom line is that we have no good science showing gum chewing results in weight loss. Could that be because the studies used artificial sweeteners that may have counteracted any benefits? Could be, but the most obvious explanation for the results to date is that chewing gum simply is not an efficacious weight loss strategy, and that's coming from researchers funded by the gum company itself. If you intentionally expose people to mercury by feeding them fish like tuna for 14 weeks and then stop, this is what happens to the level of mercury in their bloodstream. It goes up, up, and then as soon as you stop the fish, it drops back down, such that you can detox down half in about 100 days. So the half-life of total mercury in your blood is approximately 100 days. So even if you eat a lot of fish, within a few months of stopping, you can clear much of it out of your blood. But what about out of your brain? Modeling studies are all over the place, suggesting half-lives similar to blood at 69 days, all the way up to 22 years. But when you put it to the test, autopsy studies suggest it may even be longer still. Once mercury gets into your brain, it can be decades before your body can get rid of even half of it, so better than detoxing is to not tox in the first place. That's the problem with these fish advisories, where they tell pregnant women to cut down on fish. For pollutants with long half-lives, like PCBs and dioxins, temporary decreases in fish consumption, daily contaminant intake, will not necessarily translate to appreciable decreases in maternal persistent organic pollutant body burden, which is what helps determine the dose that the baby gets. For example, here's how much exposure an infant gets to a tumor-promoting pollutant called PCB153 if their mom ate fish. But if for 1 year mom ate only half the fish, or no fish at all, it wouldn't budge levels much. Only if mom cut out all fish for 5 years before do you see a really substantial drop in infant levels. So that's the fish consumption caveat. The only scenarios that produced a significant impact on children's exposures required mothers to eliminate fish from their diets completely for 5 years before their children were conceived. Substituting plant foods instead of fish would reduce prenatal and breastfeeding exposures by 37% each, and subsequent childhood exposures by 23%. So a complete ban on fish consumption may be preferable to targeted, life-stage-based fish consumption advisories. But if you are going to eat fish, which is less polluted, wild-caught or farmed fish? In this recent study, researchers measured the levels of pesticides like DDT, PCBs, polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, and toxic elements like mercury and lead in a large sample of farmed and wild-caught seafood. And in general, they found farmed was worse. Think of the suspect as farmed and dangerous. The measured levels of most organic and many inorganic pollutants were higher in the farmed seafood products, and consequently intake levels for the consumer if such products were consumed. So, for example, this is for polycyclic hydrocarbons, persistent pesticides, and PCBs. Significantly more contamination in all the farmed fish samples for all the contaminants, the salmon and sea bass, though it didn't seem to matter for crayfish, and the wild-caught mussels were actually worse. And if you split adult and child consumers into only eating farmed seafood or only eating wild-caught seafoods, the level of pollutant exposure would be significantly worse from the farmed seafood. Overall, they investigated a total of 59 pollutants and toxic elements, and taking all these data as a whole, and based on the rates of consumption of fish and seafood in the population in Spain, where the researchers hailed from, the results indicate that a theoretical consumer who chose to consume only farmed fish would be exposed to levels of pollutants about twice as high than if they would have chosen instead wild-caught fish. So you could eat twice the amount if you stuck to wild-caught. Easier said than done, though. Mislabeling rates for fish and other seafood in the U.S. is between 30 and 38%, so the average fraud rate is like 1 in 3. Though many distrust the safety of tap water, a study of 35 brands of bottled water did not find them to necessarily be safer, cleaner, or of higher quality than water straight out of the faucet. How much is that saying, though? 2 studies, published back in the 70s, forever changed our perception that drinking water safety was only about waterborne diseases. In fact, it was our fight against microbial contaminants that led to a new kind of contamination in the form of disinfection byproducts. The 2 landmark papers in '74 solved the mystery of the source of chloroform in drinking water. We met the enemy, and he is us. The chlorination of drinking water, crucial for maintaining microbiological safety, was interacting with natural organic matter from the water's source and creating chlorinated compounds that can not only result in off flavors and smells, but pose a potential public health risk. More than 600 disinfection byproducts have so far been identified. After decades of research into the matter, it appears that the lifelong ingestion of chlorinated drinking water results in clear excess risk for bladder cancer. There is also some evidence of increased risk of certain types of birth defects, but most of the concern has focused on the bladder cancer link. 40 years of exposure may increase your odds of bladder cancer by 27%. The Environmental Protection Agency estimated that between 2 to 17% of bladder cancer cases in the United States are due to these disinfection byproducts in drinking water. However, this is assuming the link is cause and effect, which has yet to be firmly established. The best way to reduce risk is to treat the cause. Countries could prevent the formation of disinfection byproducts in the first place through the better initial removal of source water's natural organic matter, what my grandmother would have called schmutz. Some countries in Europe, such as Switzerland, have newer, well-maintained drinking water systems that can distribute tap water free from residual disinfectants. But the cost to upgrade the infrastructure of even a small city here in the U.S. could run in the tens of millions. As the Flint tragedy revealed, we seem to have trouble keeping even frank toxins out of the tap. Nearly 40% of Americans use some sort of water purification device. Two of the most common approaches, pour-through pitchers and refrigerator filters, were put to the test, head-to-head against Tucson tap water. Both of the fridge filters, GE and Whirlpool, did similarly well, removing more than 96% of trace organic contaminants, edging out the three pitcher filters. Zero Water brand caught 93%, Pure pitchers got 84%, but by the time the filters needed to be replaced, Brita was only catching 50%. A similar discrepancy was found between Pure and Brita brand filters tested specifically against disinfection byproducts. They both started out about the same at the beginning, but by the end of the filter's life, Pure appeared to do better. Reverse osmosis systems can work even better, but the cost, water waste, and loss of trace minerals doesn't seem worth it. The annual cost for purifying your water with the pitcher or fridge filters was calculated out to be about the same, at only around a penny per cup, with the exception of the Zero Water brand, which is up to 4 times more expensive. I always figured that change-by dates on the filters were just company scams to get you to buy more, but I was wrong. Since I drink filtered water mostly just for taste, I used to just wait until the water started tasting funky. Bad idea. Not only do the filters eventually lose some of their removal capacity, bacterial growth can build up inside them, resulting in your so-called filtered water having higher bacterial counts than the water straight out of the tap. You'd be actually making your water dirtier rather than cleaner. So it is important to replace them regularly. As an aside, I used to think the same thing about the advice to change your toothbrush every 3 months. Like, which big brush executive thought up that one? But no, wrong again. Toothbrushes can build up biofilms of tooth decay bacteria, or become breeding grounds for bacteria flumed into the air with each toilet flush before going back into our mouths. Fun fact, a single flush can spew up millions of bacteria that can settle on your nice, moist brush. The good news is that rather than buying new ones, you can just disinfect the head of your toothbrush with as little as a 10-minute soak in white vinegar, or even more frugally, vinegar diluted in half with water. Despite the myriad menu of FDA-approved medications for weight loss, they've only been prescribed for about 1 in 50 obese patients. We worship medical magic bullets in this country. What gives? One of the reasons anti-obesity drugs are so highly stigmatized is that historically they've been anything but magical, and the bullets have been blanks or worse. Most weight loss drugs to date that were initially approved as safe have since been pulled from the market for unforeseen side effects that turned them into a public threat. As you may remember, it all started with DNP, a pesticide with a promise to safely melt away fat, but instead melted away people's eyesight. It was actually one of the things that led to the passage of the landmark Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act in 1938. Thanks to the internet, though, DNP has made a comeback with predictably lethal results. Then came the amphetamines. Currently, more than 500,000 Americans may be addicted to amphetamines like crystal meth, but the original amphetamine epidemic was generated by drug companies and doctors. By the 1960s, drug companies were churning out about 80,000 kilos a year, which is nearly enough for a weekly dose for every man, woman, and child in the United States. Billions of doses a year were prescribed for weight loss. Weight loss clinics were raking in huge profits. A dispensing diet doctor could buy 100,000 amphetamine tablets for less than $100 and turn around and sell them to patients for $12,000. At a 1970 Senate hearing, Senator Thomas Dodd, father of Dodd-Frank Senator Chris Dodd, suggested America's speed freak problem was no accidental development. He said the pharmaceutical industry's multi-hundred-million-dollar advertising budgets, frequently the most costly ingredient in the price of a pill, have, pill by pill, led, coaxed, and seduced post-World War II generations into the freaked-out drug culture. I'll leave drawing the big pharma parallels to the current opioid crisis as an exercise for the viewer. Aminorexx was a widely prescribed appetite suppressant before it was pulled for causing lung damage. 18 million Americans were on fen-phen before it was pulled from the market for causing severe damage to heart valves. Meridia was pulled for heart attacks and strokes, Acomplia for psychiatric side effects, including suicide, and the list goes on. The fen-phen debacle resulted in some of the largest litigation payouts in the industry's history, but it's all baked into the formula. If you read the journal Pharmacoeconomics, and who doesn't, sure, a new weight loss drug may injure and kill so many that expected litigation costs could exceed $80 million, but big pharma consultants estimate if successful, the drug could bring in over $100 million, so do the math. Current options for weight loss medications include the ridiculously named Qsymia, a combination of phentermine, the fen in fen-phen, and topiramate, a drug that can cause seizures if you stop it abruptly. It was explicitly rejected multiple times for safety reasons in Europe, but remains for sale here in the USA, or at least at the time I made this video. Belviq is in a similar boat, allowed here, but not in Europe, out of concerns about it possibly causing cancer, psychiatric disorders, and heart valve problems. It's sold in the US for about $200 a month, but if you think that's bad, there's Saxenda, which requires daily injections, listed at the low price of only $1,281, and don't forget the 96 cents for a 30-day supply. It carries a black box warning, FDA's strictest caution about potentially life-threatening hazards for thyroid cancer risk. Paid consultants and employees of the company that makes it argue the greater number of breast tumors found among drug recipients may be due to enhanced ascertainment, meaning easier breast cancer detection just due to the drug's effectiveness. Contrave is another option, if you ignore the black box warning about a potential increase in suicidal thoughts. And then there's Ally. It's the drug that causes fat malabsorption and thereby causes side effects, with names like Flatus with discharge. It can be your ally in anal leakage. The drug evidently forces the patient to use diapers and to know the location of all the bathrooms in the neighborhood in an attempt to limit the consequences of urgent leakage of oily fecal matter. A Freedom of Information Act expose found that though company-sponsored studies claimed all adverse events were recorded, one trial apparently conveniently failed to mention 1,318 of them. What's a little bowel leakage, though, compared to the ravages of obesity? As with anything in life, it's all about risks versus benefits. But in an analysis of more than 100 clinical trials of anti-obesity medications lasting up to 47 weeks long, drug-induced weight loss never exceeded more than 9 pounds. That's a lot of money and risk for just a few pounds. Since you're not treating the underlying cause, a fattening diet, when people stop taking these drugs, the weight tends to come right back, so you'd have to take them every day for the rest of your life. And people do stop taking them. Using pharmacy data from 1 million people, most Ally users stopped after the first purchase. Most Meridia users didn't even make it 3 months. taking weight loss meds are so disagreeable that 98% stop taking them within the first year. Studies show many doctors tend to overestimate the amount of weight loss caused by these drugs, or were simply clueless. One reason may be that some clinical practice guidelines go out of their way to advocate prescribing medications for obesity. Are they seriously recommending drugging a third of Americans, more than 100 million people? You will not be surprised to learn that the principal authors of the guidelines had a significant financial interest or leadership position in 6 separate pharmaceutical companies that all, coincidentally, worked on obesity drugs. In contrast, independent expert panels, like the Canadian Task Force on Preventive Healthcare, explicitly recommend against weight loss drugs, given their poor track record of safety and efficacy. In a review of more than 100 articles about the effects of cooking on vegetables, they tried to find the sweet spot. On one hand, heat can destroy certain nutrients. On the other hand, by softening the tissues, they can become more bioavailable. Researchers settled upon steaming as the best cooking method to preserve the most nutrition. You're not dunking it in water or oil, where the nutrients can leach out, and you're not reaching excessive dry heat temperatures. But they acknowledge that of all the common cooking methods, we know the least about pressure cooking. There's all these fancy new electric pressure cookers on the market, including the Instant Pot, with more 5-star ratings than even How Not to Die. I'm jealous. These pressure cookers are great for cooking dried beans with just a touch of a button, but what happens to the nutrition? Here's the antioxidant content of pre-soaked black beans, boiled for an hour normally. Compare that to pressure cooking for 15 minutes. Even more. In fact, 6 times more. Wow. Here I was pressure cooking just because I like the texture better. I mean, the canned ones can be a bit mushy, and I was spending lots of money on cases of canned beans, whereas dried beans are just so dirt cheap. So wait, cheaper, tastier, and healthier? That's quite a combo. OK, but what about pressure cooking vegetables? Vitamin C is one of the more heat-sensitive nutrients. Sauté spinach or amaranth leaves in a pan for 30 minutes, and about 95% of the vitamin C is destroyed, whereas 10 minutes in a pressure cooker wiped out only about 90%. But who pressure cooks spinach for 10 minutes? And sautéing for half an hour? And even then, not much effects on beta-carotene levels either way. Vitamin C is but one of many antioxidants. What about the effects of pressure cooking on overall antioxidant capacity? Here's the cooking methods they compared. So for the carrots, for example, 12 minutes of boiling compared to 5 minutes of pressure cooking compared to 6 minutes of microwaving. Here's what they found. Cooking carrots increased their antioxidant potential. In fact, pressure cooking nearly doubled their antioxidant value, whereas peas took a hit no matter how they were cooked. I'm particularly interested in the greens. The chard wasn't affected much across the board, but microwaving beat out pressure cooking and boiling for the spinach. Note that pressure cooking beat out the boiling too, though, and pressure cooking is boiling, just at a shorter time and a higher temperature. But the time appeared to trump the temperature. Significantly less nutrient loss pressure cooking spinach for 3.5 minutes compared to boiling for 8. Same for those magical cancer-fighting glucosinolate compounds in cruciferous greens, the healthiest greens, like kale, collards, and turnip greens. Here's where levels started out raw, with 3/4 wiped out by boiling, but less than half with pressure cooking. Now, both got beat by steaming, but that's because you weren't dunking the greens in water, which can leach out the nutrients. But even though the pressure-cooked greens were immersed just as much as the boiled greens, only half the nutrient losses, presumably because it was only half the time, 7 minutes pressure-cooked compared to 15 minutes boiled. OK, so here's my idea. This was after 10 minutes of steaming. What if you cut down that time by pressure steaming? Like put a layer of water down at the bottom of an electric pressure cooker, drop in a metal steaming basket on top, and then put the greens in and steam under pressure. That's how I cook the greens I eat every day. I've always loved collards in Southern cooking or Ethiopian cuisine, and I found I could get that same melt-in-your-mouth texture just steaming under pressure for 0 minutes. What you do is set for 0, so it shuts off as soon as it reaches the cooking pressure, and then quick-release valve it immediately to release the steam. The greens turn out perfect, bright, emerald green, cooked tender. Give it a try, and let me know what you think. Blood sugar, also known as blood glucose, is the universal go-to fuel for the cells throughout our bodies. Our brain burns through 1/4 pound of sugar a day. It's preferred metabolic fuel. Our body can break down proteins and make glucose from scratch, but most comes from our diet in the form of sugars and starches. If we stop eating carbohydrates, or stop eating altogether, most of our cells switch over to burning fat. But fat has difficulty getting through the blood-brain barrier. But our brain has this constant massive need for fuel, one organ accounting for up to half of our energy needs. Without it, the lights go out permanently. To make that much sugar from scratch, our body would need to break down about 1/2 pound of protein a day. That means we'd cannibalize ourselves to death within 2 weeks, but people can fast for months. The answer to the puzzle was discovered in 1967. Harvard researchers famously stuck catheters into the brains of obese subjects who had been fasting for over a month, and discovered that ketones had replaced glucose as the preferred fuel for the brain. Your liver can turn fat into ketones, which can then breach the blood-brain barrier and sustain your brain if you're not getting enough carbohydrates. Switching fuels has such an effect on brain activity that it has been used to treat epilepsy since antiquity. The prescription of fasting for the treatment of epileptic seizures dates back to Hippocrates. In the Bible, Jesus seems to have concurred. To this day, it's unclear why switching from blood sugar to ketones as a primary fuel source has such a dampening effect on brain overactivity. How long can you fast, though? To prolong the fasting therapy, in 1921, a distinguished physician-scientist at the Mayo Clinic suggested trying what he called a ketogenic diet, a high-fat diet designed to be so deficient in carbohydrates it could effectively mimic the fasting state. Remarkable improvement was noted the first time it was put to the test, efficacy that was later confirmed in randomized controlled trials. Ketogenic diets started to fall out of favor in 1938 with the discovery of the anti-seizure drug, which would become known as Dilantin, but ketogenic diets are still in use today as a 3rd or 4th-line treatment for drug-refractory epilepsy in children. Oddly, the success of ketogenic diets against pediatric epilepsy seems to get conflated by keto diet proponents into suggesting a ketogenic diet is beneficial for everyone. But you know what else sometimes works for intractable epilepsy? Brain surgery. But I don't hear people at the gym clamoring to get their skulls sawed open. Right? Since when do medical therapies translate into healthy lifestyle choices? Scrambling brain activity with electroshock therapy can be helpful in some cases of major depression, so what, pass the electrodes? Ketogenic diets are also being tested to see if they can slow the growth of certain brain tumors. Even if it works, you know what else can help slow cancer growth? Chemotherapy. So why go keto when you can just go chemo? Promoters of ketogenic diets for cancer, paid for by so-called ketone technology companies, that will send you salted caramel bone broth powder for $100 a pound, or companies that market ketogenic meals, report extraordinary anecdotal responses in some cancer patients, but more concrete evidence is simply lacking. Even the theoretical underpinnings may be questionable. A common refrain is that cancer feeds on sugar. But all cells feed on sugar. Advocating ketogenic diets for cancer is like saying, Hitler breathed air, so let's boycott oxygen." Cancer can feed on ketones too. Ketones have been found to fuel human breast cancer growth and drive metastases in an experimental model, more than doubling tumor growth. Some have even speculated that may be why breast cancer often metastasizes to the liver, the main site of ketone production. If you drip ketones on breast cancer cells in a petri dish directly, the genes that get turned on and off make for a much more aggressive cancer, associated with a significantly lower 5-year survival in breast cancer patients. Researchers are even considering designing ketone-blocking drugs to prevent further cancer growth by halting ketone production. And think about what eating a ketogenic diet might entail. High animal fat intake may increase the mortality risk among breast cancer survivors and potentially play a role in its development in the first place, through oxidative stress, hormone disruption, or inflammation. Men, too. A strong association has been found between saturated fat intake and prostate cancer progression. Those in the top third of consumption of these kinds of fat-rich animal foods appeared to triple their risk of dying from prostate cancer. Not necessarily fat in general, no difference in breast cancer death rates based on total fat intake, but saturated fat intake may negatively impact breast cancer survival, a 50% increased risk of dying from breast cancer. There's a reason the official American Cancer Society and American Society of Clinical Oncology breast cancer survivorship care guidelines recommend a dietary pattern for breast cancer patients that's essentially the opposite of a ketogenic diet. High in vegetables, fruits, whole grains, and legumes, meaning beans, split peas, chickpeas, and lentils, and low in saturated fats. So far, not a single clinical study has shown a measurable benefit from a ketogenic diet for any human cancer. There are currently at least a dozen trials underway, however, and the hope is that at least some cancer types will respond. Still, even then, that wouldn't serve as a basis for recommending ketogenic diets for the general population, any more than recommending everyone go out and get radiation surgery and chemo for kicks. When you don't eat enough carbohydrates, you force your body to burn more fat. However, this rise in fat burning is often misconstrued as a greater rate of net fat mass reduction on the body. But that ignores the fact that on a ketogenic diet, your fat intake shoots up as well. The question is, what happens to your overall body fat balance? You can't empty a tub by widening the drain if you're cranking up the faucet at the same time. Low-carb advocates had a theory, though, the so-called carbohydrate insulin model of obesity. Proponents of low-carb diets, whether a ketogenic diet or more relaxed form of carbohydrate restriction, suggested that the decreased insulin secretion would lead to less fat storage, and so even if you were eating more fat, less of it would stick to your frame. So we'd be burning more and storing less, the perfect combination for fat loss, or so the theory went. To their credit, instead of just speculating about it, they decided to put it to the test. Gary Taubes formed the Nutrition Science Initiative to sponsor research to validate the carbohydrate insulin model. He's the journalist who wrote the controversial 2002 New York Times Magazine piece, "What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie?", which attempted to turn nutrition dogma on its head by arguing in favor of the Atkins diet, with its bunless bacon cheeseburgers based on the carbohydrate insulin model. Much of Nina Teicholz's book, The Big Fat Surprise, is simply recycled from Taubes' earlier work. In response, some of the very researchers Taubes cited to support his thesis accused him of twisting their words. "The article was incredibly misleading," one said. "I was horrified. He took this weird little idea and blew it up, and people believed him," said another. "What a disaster." It doesn't matter what people say, though. All that matters is the science. Taubes attracted $40 million in committed funding for his nutrition science initiative to prove to the world you could lose more body fat on a ketogenic diet. They contracted noted NIH researcher Kevin Hall to perform the study. 17 overweight men were effectively locked in what's called a metabolic ward for 2 months to allow researchers total control over their diets. For the first month, they were placed on a typical high-carbohydrate diet, 50% carbohydrate, 35% fat, 15% protein. And then they were switched to a low-carb ketogenic diet, only 5% calories from carbohydrate, 80% fat, for the second month. Now, both diets had the same number of daily calories. So if a calorie is a calorie when it comes to weight loss, then there should be no difference in body fat loss on the regular diet versus the ketogenic diet. If Taubes was right, though, if fat calories were somehow less fattening, then body fat loss would become accelerated. What happened instead, in the very study funded by the Nutrition Science Initiative, was that body fat loss slowed upon switching to the ketogenic diet. Wait, why do people think the keto diet works if it's actually slowing fat loss? Well, if you just looked at the readings on their bathroom scales, the ketogenic diet would seem like a smashing success. They went from losing less than a pound a week on the regular diet in the 2 weeks before they switched, to losing 3.5 pounds within 7 days after the switch to the ketogenic diet. But what was happening inside their bodies told a totally different story. Their rate of body fat loss was slowed by more than half. So most of what they were losing was just water weight. The reason they started burning less fat on a ketogenic diet was presumed to be because without the preferred fuel, carbohydrates, their body started burning more of its own protein. And that's exactly what happened. Switching to a ketogenic diet made them lose less fat mass and more fat-free mass. They lost more lean mass. That may help explain why the leg muscles of CrossFit trainees placed on a ketogenic diet may shrink as much as 8%. The vastus lateralis is your biggest quads muscle in your leg, shrunk in thickness by 8% on a ketogenic diet. Yes, the study subjects started burning more fat on the ketogenic diet, but they were also eating so much more fat on the keto diet that they ended up retaining more fat in their body despite the lower insulin levels. This is diametrically opposite to what the keto crowd predicted, and this from the guy they paid to support their theory. In science speak, the carbohydrate insulin model failed experimental interrogation. In light of this experimental falsification of the low-carb theory, the Nutrition Science Initiative effectively collapsed. But based on their tax returns, not before Taubes and his co-founder personally pocketed millions of dollars in compensation. The carbohydrate insulin model of obesity, the underlying theory that ketogenic diets have some sort of metabolic advantage, has been experimentally falsified. The keto diet's proponents' own studies showed the exact opposite. Ketogenic diets actually put you at a metabolic disadvantage and slow the loss of body fat. How much does fat loss slow down on a low-carb diet? If you cut about 800 calories a day of carbohydrates from your diet, you lose 53 grams of body fat a day. But if you cut the same number of fat calories, you lose 89 grams a day. Same number of calories, but 9 pats of butter worth of extra fat melting off your body every day on a low-fat diet, compared to the low-carb diet. Same number of calories, but about 80% more fat loss when you cut down on fat instead of carbs. Here's the graph. Cut 800 calories from your diet by cutting carbs, and you do lose body fat, but cut out the same number of calories by cutting fat, and you lose even more body fat, 80% more body fat lost. The title of the study speaks for itself. Calorie for calorie, dietary fat restriction results in more body fat loss than carbohydrate restriction in people with obesity. But just looking at the bathroom scale, though, would mislead you into thinking the opposite. After 6 days on the low-carb diet, study subjects lost 4 pounds. On the low-fat diet, they lost less than 3. So step on the scale, and it looks like the low-carb diet wins hands down. So you can see why low-carb diets are so popular. But what was happening inside their bodies tells the real story. The low-carb group was losing mostly lean mass, water and protein. This loss of water weight helps explain why low-carb diets have been such cash cows for publishers over the last 150 years. That's their secret. As one weight loss expert noted, rapid water loss is the $33 billion diet gimmick. When you eat carbohydrates, your body bulks your muscles up with glycogen for quick energy. Eat a high-carbohydrate diet for 3 days, and you may add about 3 pounds of muscle mass onto your arms and legs. Those glycogen stores drain away, though, on a low-carb diet and pull water out with it. And the ketones also need to be flushed out of the kidneys, pulling out even more water. On the scale, that can manifest as 4 more pounds coming off within 10 days, but that all can be accounted for in water loss. The bottom line, keto diets just don't hold water. But the thrill of seeing the pounds come off so quickly on the scale keeps many coming back. When the diet fails, the dieters often blame themselves. But the intoxication of that initial rapid weight loss may tempt them back, like getting drunk again after forgetting how terrible the last hangover was. This has been dubbed the false hope syndrome. The diet industry thrives off a repeat customer, something low-carb diets were built for, given that rapid initial water loss. But what we care about is body fat. In 6 days, the low-fat diet extracted a total of 80% more fat from the body than the low-carb diet. That's not just one study. If you look at all the controlled feeding trials, where researchers compared low-carb diets to low-fat diets, swapping the same number of carb calories for fat calories, or vice versa, if a calorie is just a calorie, then all the studies should have crossed that zero line in the middle, and indeed, 6 did. One study showed more fat loss on a low-carb diet, but every other study favored the low-fat diet. More loss of body fat eating the same number of calories. Put all the studies together, and we're talking 16 grams more daily body fat loss on the low-fat diets. That's 4 more pats of butter melting off your body on a daily basis. Less fat in the mouth means less fat on the hips, even taking in the same number of calories. The new data is set to debunk some, if not all, of the popular claims made by extreme carbohydrate restriction. But what about ketones suppressing your hunger? In the tightly controlled metabolic ward study, where the ketogenic diet made things worse, everyone was made to eat the same number of calories. So yes, eat the same number of calories on a keto diet and lose less body fat. But out in the real world, maybe all those ketones would spoil your appetite enough that you'd end up eating significantly less overall. On a low-carb diet, people ended up storing 300 more calories of fat every day. But outside the laboratory, if you were in a state of ketosis, maybe you could offset that if you were able to sustainably eat significantly less. Paradoxically, people may experience less hunger on a total fast compared to an extremely low-calorie diet. This may be thanks to ketones. In the state of ketosis, when you have high levels of ketones in your bloodstream, your hunger is dampened. How do we know it's the ketones? Because if you inject ketones straight into people's veins, even those who are not fasting lose their appetite, sometimes even to the point of getting nauseated and vomiting. So ketones can explain why after a few days you might feel hungrier on a low-calorie diet than on a total zero-calorie diet, a fast. Can we then exploit the appetite-suppressing effects of ketosis by eating a ketogenic diet? If you ate so few carbs to sustain brain function, couldn't you trick your body into thinking you're fasting and get your liver to start pumping out ketones? Sure, but is it safe, and is it effective? A meta-analysis of 48 randomized trials of various branded diets found that those advised to eat low-carb diets and those told to eat low-fat diets lost nearly identical amounts of weight after a year. Now, obviously, high attrition rates and poor dietary adherence complicate comparisons of efficacy. I mean, they weren't actually put on these diets, they were just told to eat that way. But you could see how even just moving in each respective direction can get rid of a lot of CRAP, which is Jeff Novick's beloved acronym for calorie-rich and processed foods. After all, the 4 largest calorie contributors in the American diet are refined grains, added fats, meat, and added sugars. Low-carb diets cut down on 1 and 4, and low-fat diets tend to cut down on 2 and 3. So they both tell people to cut down on donuts. Any diet that does that already has a leg up. I figure a don't eat anything that starts with the letter D diet could also successfully cause weight loss if it caused people to cut down on donuts, Danishes, and Doritos, even if it makes no nutritional sense to exclude something like dill. The secret to long-term weight loss success on any diet is compliance. Diet adherence is difficult, though, because anytime you try to cut calories, your body ramps up your appetite to try to compensate. This is why traditional weight loss approaches like portion control tend to fail. For long-term success, measured not in weeks or months, but in years and decades, this day-to-day hunger problem must be overcome. On a wholesome plant-based diet, this can be accomplished thanks in part to calorie density. You're just eating so much food. On a ketogenic diet, it may be accomplished with ketosis. In a systematic review and meta-analysis entitled, "Did ketogenic diets really suppress appetite?" the answer, they found, was yes. Also, ketogenic diets offer the unique advantage of being able to track dietary compliance in real time with ketone test strips you can pee on to see if you're still in ketosis. There's no pee stick that will tell you if you're eating enough fruits and veggies. All you have is the bathroom scale. Keto compliance may be more in theory than practice, though. Even in studies where ketogenic diets are being used to control seizures, after a few months, dietary compliance may drop to under 50%. This can be tragic for those with intractable epilepsy, but for everyone else, the difficulty in sticking to ketogenic diets long-term may actually be a lifesaver. Given the decades of use of ketogenic diets to treat certain cases of pediatric epilepsy, a body of safety data has accumulated. Nutrient deficiencies would seem to be the obvious issue. Inadequate intake of 17 micronutrients, vitamins and minerals, has been documented in those on strict ketogenic diets. Dieting is a particularly important time to make sure you're meeting all your essential nutrient requirements, since you may be taking in less food. Ketogenic diets tend to be so nutritionally vacuous that one assessment estimated that to get a sufficient daily intake of all essential vitamins and minerals, you'd have to eat more than 37,000 calories a day. That's one of the advantages of more plant-based approaches. As the editor-in-chief of the Journal of the American Dietetic Association put it, what could be more nutrient-dense than a vegetarian diet? Choosing a healthy diet may be easier than sticking 50 sticks of butter in your coffee. And we're not talking about just not reaching your daily allowances. Children have gotten scurvy on ketogenic diets, and some have even died from selenium deficiency, which can cause sudden cardiac death. The vitamin and mineral deficiencies can be solved with supplements, but what about the paucity of prebiotics, the dozens of types of fiber and resistant starches found concentrated in whole grains and beans that you'd be missing out on? Not surprisingly, constipation is very common on keto diets, but as I reviewed before, Starving our microbial self of prebiotics can have a whole array of negative consequences. Ketogenic diets have been shown to reduce the richness and diversity of our gut flora. Microbiome changes can be detected within 24 hours of switching to a high-fat, low-fiber diet. The lack of fiber starves our good gut bacteria, but we used to think dietary fat itself was nearly all absorbed in the small intestine. But based on studies using radioactive tracers, we now know that about 7% of the saturated fat in a fat-rich meal can make it down to the colon, which may result in detrimental changes in our gut microbiome, weight gain, increased leaky gut, pro-inflammatory changes. For example, a drop in beneficial bifidobacteria and a decrease in overall short-chain fatty acid production, both of which would be expected to increase the risk of gastrointestinal disorders. OK, but striking at the heart of the matter, what might all that saturated fat be doing to our heart? If you look at low-carbohydrate diets and all-cause mortality, those who eat lower-carb diets suffer a significantly higher risk of all-cause mortality, meaning they live, on average, significantly shorter lives. From a heart disease perspective, though, it matters if it's an animal fat or plant fat. Based on the famous Harvard cohorts, eating more of an animal-based low-carb diet was associated with higher death rates from cardiovascular disease, 50% higher risk of dying from a heart attack or stroke, but no such association was found for lower-carb diets based on plant sources. And it wasn't just Harvard. Low-carbohydrate dietary patterns favoring animal protein and fat, from sources such as red meat and chicken, were associated with higher mortality, whereas those favoring plant protein and fat, from things like vegetables, nuts, peanut butter, whole grains, was associated with lower mortality. Cholesterol production in the body is directly correlated to body weight. Every pound of weight loss, by nearly any means, is associated with about a 1-point drop in cholesterol levels in the blood. But put people on very low-carb ketogenic diets, and the beneficial effect on LDL bad cholesterol is blunted or even completely neutralized. Counterbalancing changes in LDL size, or HDL, what we used to think of as good cholesterol, are not considered sufficient to offset this risk. You don't have to wait until cholesterol builds up in your arteries, though, to have adverse effects. Within 3 hours of eating a meal high in saturated fat, you can see a significant impairment of artery function. Even with a dozen pounds of weight loss, artery function worsens on a ketogenic diet, which appears to be the case with low-carb diets in general. So, bad for the gut, bad for the heart, but is it bad to the bone? An official International Society of Sports Nutrition position paper covering keto diets notes the ergolytic effects of keto diets on both high and low-intensity workouts. Ergolytic is the opposite of ergogenic. Ergogenic means performance boosting, whereas ergolytic means athletic performance impairing. For non-athletes, ketosis may also undermine exercise efforts. Ketosis was correlated with increased feelings of perceived effort and fatigue and mood disturbances during physical activity, suggesting that the ability and desire to maintain sustained exercise might be adversely impacted in individuals adhering to ketogenic diets for weight loss. I already mentioned the shrinkage of measured muscle size among CrossFit trainees, so a ketogenic diet may not just blunt the performance of endurance athletics, but strength training as well. Have people do 8 weeks of all the standard upper and lower body training protocols, bench press, pull-ups, squats, deadlifts, and no surprise, you boost muscle mass, unless you're on a keto diet, in which case there was no significant change in muscle mass after all that effort. Those randomized to the non-ketogenic diet added about 3 pounds of muscle, whereas the same amount of weightlifting on the keto diet tended to subtract muscle, an average loss of about 3.5 ounces of muscle. How else could you do 8 weeks of weights and not gain a single ounce of muscle, but on a ketogenic diet? Even keto diet advocates call bodybuilding on a ketogenic diet an oxymoron. What about bone loss. Sadly, bone fractures are one of the side effects that disproportionately plagues children placed on ketogenic diets, along with growth stunting and kidney stones. Ketogenic diets may cause a steady rate of bone loss, as measured in the spine, presumed to be because ketones are acidic, and so keto diets can put people in what's called a chronic acidotic state. Some of the case reports of children on keto diets are truly heart-wrenching. One 9-year-old girl seemed to get it all: osteoporosis, bone fractures, kidney stones, and then she got pancreatitis and died. Pancreatitis can be triggered by having too much fat in your blood. A single high-fat meal can cause a quintupling of the spike in triglycerides in your bloodstream within hours of consumption, which can put you at risk for inflammation of the pancreas. She had a rare genetic disorder called glucose transporter deficiency syndrome, where you're born with a defect in ferrying blood sugar into your brain. This can result in daily seizures starting in infancy, but a ketogenic diet can be used as a way to sneak fuel into their brains. So a ketogenic diet can be a godsend for the 1 in 90,000 families stricken with this disorder. As with anything in medicine, it's all about risks versus benefits. As many as 30% of patients with epilepsy don't respond to anti-seizure drugs, and the alternatives aren't pretty, including things like brain surgery. This can mean implanting deep electrodes through the skull, or even removing a lobe of your brain. This can obviously lead to serious side effects, but so can having seizures every day. So if a ketogenic diet helps with seizures, the pros can far outweigh the cons. For those just choosing a diet to lose weight, though, the cost-benefit analysis would really seem to go the other way. Thankfully, you don't need to mortgage your long-term health for short-term weight loss. We can get the best of both worlds by choosing a healthy diet. Remember that study that showed that the weight loss after being told to eat the low-carb Atkins diet for a year was almost identical to those told to eat the low-fat Ornish diet? The authors concluded this supports the practice of recommending any diet that a patient will adhere to in order to lose weight. That seems like terrible advice. There are regimens out there like the Last Chance diet, which evidently consisted of a liquid formula made from leftover byproducts from a slaughterhouse, that was linked to approximately 60 deaths. Well, it did promise to change people's lives. An ensuing failed lawsuit from one widower laid the precedent for the First Amendment protection for deadly diet books. It's possible to construct a healthy low-carb diet, or an unhealthy low-fat diet. A diet of cotton candy would be zero fat. But the health effects of a typical low-carb ketogenic diet like Atkins are vastly different from a low-fat plant-based diet like Ornish's. Not only would they have diametrically opposed effects on cardiovascular risk factors in theory, based on fiber and saturated fat and cholesterol contents of their representative meal plans, when actually put to the test, low-carb diets were found to impair artery function. Over time, blood flow to the heart muscle itself is improved on an Ornish-style diet, and diminished on a low-carb diet. Heart disease tends to progress on typical weight loss diets, actively worsen on low-carb diets, but may be reversed by an Ornish-style diet. Given that heart disease is the #1 killer of men and women, recommending any diet that a patient will adhere to in order to lose weight seems irresponsible. Why not tell people to smoke? Cigarettes can cause weight loss too, as can tuberculosis and a good meth habit, but the goal of weight loss is not to lighten the load for your pallbearers. Ketogenic diets can certainly lower blood sugars, better than conventional diets, so much so there's a keto product company that claims ketogenic diets can reverse diabetes. But they are confusing the symptom, high blood sugars, with the disease, which is carbohydrate intolerance. People with diabetes can't properly handle carbohydrates, and this manifests as high blood sugars. Sure, if you stick to eating mostly fat, your blood sugars will stay low, but you may actually be making the underlying disease worse at the same time. We've known for nearly a century that if you put people on a ketogenic diet, their carbohydrate intolerance can skyrocket within just 2 days. Here's the blood sugar response of someone eating sugar after 2 days eating a high-carb diet. Here's exposure to the same amount of sugar after a high-fat diet for 2 days. Their intolerance to carbohydrates skyrocketed on a high-fat diet. 1 week on a 80% fat diet, you can quintuple your blood sugar spike in reaction to the same carb load compared to a week on a low-fat diet. Even a single day of excessive dietary fat intake can do it. If you're going in for a diabetes test, having a fatty dinner the night before can adversely affect your results. One meal high in saturated fat can make the cause of diabetes, carbohydrate intolerance, worse within 4 hours. Now, with enough weight loss by any means, whether from cholera or bariatric surgery, type 2 diabetes can be reversed, but a keto diet for diabetes may not just be papering over the cracks, but actively throwing fuel on the fire. I've been trying to think of a good metaphor. It's easy to come up with things that just treat the symptoms without helping the underlying disease, like giving someone with pneumonia aspirin for their fever instead of antibiotics. But a keto diet for diabetes is worse than that, because it may treat the symptoms while actively worsening the disease. So maybe it's more like curing the fever by throwing that pneumonia patient out into a snowbank, or maybe curing your amputated finger by amputating your hand. No more unsightly finger stub. One of the co-founders of MasteringDiabetes.org suggested it's like a CEO that makes their bad bottom line look better by just borrowing tons of new cash. The outer numbers look better, but on the inside, the company's just digging itself a deeper hole. Remember The Club? Maybe I just watched too much late-night TV growing up, but it's a car anti-theft device that attaches to your steering wheel and locks it in place, so the steering column can only turn a few inches. Imagine you're in a car at the top of a hill with the steering wheel locked. Then the car starts rolling down the hill. What do? Oh, did I mention there's also something stuck under your brake pedal, too? The keto diet equivalent response to this situation is who cares if you're barreling down into traffic with no brakes and a locked steering wheel? Just stick to really straight, deserted roads without any stop signs or traffic lights. If you do that, problem solved. Yeah, the longer you go, the more speed you'll pick up, and so if you should hit a dietary bump in the road or start to veer off the path, the consequences could get more and more disastrous with time, but if you stick to the keto straight and narrow, you'll be A-OK. In contrast, the non-keto response would be to just unlock the steering wheel and dislodge whatever's under your brake. In other words, fix the underlying problem instead of just whistling past and then into the graveyard. The reason keto proponents claim they can quote-unquote reverse diabetes is that they can successfully wean type 2 diabetics off their insulin. But that's like faith healing someone out of the need for a wheelchair by making them lie in bed the rest of their lives. No need for a wheelchair if you never move. Their carbohydrate intolerance isn't gone, their diabetes isn't gone. It could be as bad or even worse. Type 2 diabetes is reversed when you can wean people off insulin eating a normal diet like everybody else. Then and only then do you not have diabetes anymore. A true diabetes reversal diet is practically the opposite of a ketogenic diet. Diabetics off their insulin within a matter of weeks, eating more than 300 grams of carbs a day. The irony doesn't stop there. One of the reasons diabetics suffer such nerve and artery damage is due to an inflammatory metabolic toxin known as methylglyoxal that forms at high blood sugar levels. Methylglyoxal is the most potent creator of advanced glycation end products, the so-called AGEs, which are implicated in degenerative disease from Alzheimer's disease and cataracts to kidney disease and strokes. You get AGEs in your body from two sources, eating them preformed in your diet or making them internally from methylglyoxal if you have high blood sugar levels. On a keto diet, one would expect high exposure to preformed AGEs, since they're found concentrated in animal-derived foods high in fat and protein, but we would expect less internal new formation due to presumably low levels of methylglyoxal, given lower blood sugars not eating carbs. Dartmouth researchers were surprised to find more methylglyoxal, though. A few weeks on the Atkins diet led to a significant increase in methylglyoxal levels. And those in active ketosis did even worse, doubling the level of this glycotoxin in their bloodstream. It turns out high sugars may not be the only way to create this toxin. One of the ketones you make on a ketogenic diet is acetone, known for its starring role in nail polish remover. Acetone does more than just make keto dieters fail breathalyzer tests and develop what's been described as rotten apple breath. Acetone can oxidize in the blood to acetol, which may be a precursor for methylglyoxal. That may be why keto dieters can end up with levels of this glycotoxin as high as those with out-of-control diabetes, which can cause the nerve damage and blood vessel damage you see in diabetics. That's another way keto dieters can end up with a heart attack. So the irony of treating diabetes with a keto diet may extend beyond just making the underlying diabetes worse, but by mimicking some of the disease's dire consequences.